I've never thought that I remembered a past life, but one experience was close. My first trip to the French Quarter in New Orleans, I knew that place. It wasn't just that I recognized bits of it seen in media, because that's a set of two-dimensional imagery, and I knew the place in three-dimensional detail. I knew the specific location of everything and the history of every building like I had studied it. It felt familiar and comfortable, like my home, even though I had never been there. I was telling my friend what was around the corners before we turned them, and what the buildings once were. Many of those buildings have plaques out front, and when we got close enough to read, I was right every time. Then we left, and I couldn't remember anything that I knew while I was there. All of the history of the buildings, the specifics of building locations, everything, gone, like I never knew it. And, in fact, that's how it should have been while I was there. I've never studied New Orleans. All I can figure is that I must have picked up bits and pieces of it somewhere, and being there, actually seeing the place, all those little kernels of knowledge came up. That has to be the case. But it was a tremendously weird experience, and were I more predisposed to mysticism, I'd probably think I must have lived there in a past life. I haven't been back since. Just to be clear, there was no alcohol, drug use, nor weird religious stuff involved here, just a visit to a place that, while I was there, was much more familiar to me than it should have been. I don't specifically remember any past lives, but I believe that I've had them. First, there's the meditation. The oldest memory I have of it was 5, but I got a feeling from that memory that I'd been doing it for years already at that point. I called it going to the place with no words. In my earliest memory of it, I was camping with my family in Yellowstone. I was sitting by a lake or pond, staring at the landscape reflected in the water. I had gone to the place with no words. Although this place had no words, I could often put things together in that place, connect thoughts, etc., and sometimes I could leave that place, still holding on to my new understanding. In this particular memory, I was ripped from the place when the surface of the water I was looking at became disrupted by drops of water. I snapped back into reality, realized that if it were rain, my parents might be worried about me, and headed back to our campsite. It wasn't until I started studying meditation 15 years later that I realized that I'd been doing it since I was toddling, just under a different name. There was one other thing. I grew up in a small town with one doctor. I only went to him a few times, once for an ear infection, once for bronchitis, and once or twice with my friend's mom when she was watching me and had to take her kid. I ran into him at the cafe near his office while visiting my parents when I was about 20. We were casually talking when he suddenly asked me, "Do you think you are an old soul?" I said yes without thinking, but his question got me thinking. Why he asked me that question burned at me for years, so I asked him the next time I saw him, maybe 3 years later. He enigmatically replied, "Oh, it was just something you said when you were little," but he refused to tell me more. So I've come to the conclusion that I was a master of meditation in my past life, which is why I instinctually knew how to do it before the age of 5, but I still really want to know what I said to that doctor that was good enough for him to wait 20 years to ask me if I was an old soul. I'm fairly on the fence about reincarnation. I both believe it, but am skeptical towards it and often question myself. What makes me believe there is some truth to it is the fact that I have several memories that seem so incredibly vivid that don't belong to me. For instance, I remember Harlem in the 1980s, and have since I was a small child, despite never having been there and was born in 1992. Like, I can feel the heat coming off the front stoops, have memories of playing basketball with friends, etc. I also have a memory of what I feel like is ancient Egypt. I can feel hot wind, get annoyed at the sand in my sandals, can remember myself walking through winding streets and busy markets with all the sights, sounds, and smells. These memories are often more vivid than some of my real memories. I've discussed this with my mom, and she has some of the same memories. We're both huge history buffs, and are drawn to certain times and places in history and get very protective of those places. For instance, my mom has memories of a late medieval Scotland, and gets very emotional when reading about or thinking about those times. I, in turn, get very offended when people suggest aliens built the pyramids. So, in summation, it's something I don't really know for sure. It's an unprovable phenomenon, so it's just something interesting I like to research. I have been tested for psychosis before, and the psychiatrist, after the interview, told me he didn't even know why I was referred to him and was one of the most lucid people he'd met and definitely didn't suffer from any psychotic illnesses. To me, it's just a big question mark, a fun, interesting thing to explore, but it can't be verified, so I scrutinize it very closely and take these memories with a grain of salt. I also feel like if reincarnation is real, I was male in my past few lives. In my Egyptian memories, I am a female. I don't know why, but I often feel frustrated and restrained that I am a female. I'm neither a feminist nor have gender identity issues, so the fact I feel this way is sometimes confusing. Also, I remember with my ex-boyfriend, I had this feeling I'd met him before and watched him go to war, specifically World War I. I seem to remember his picture, and when looking at him, I had this feeling of seeing him for the last time before war. I told him this, and he got really freaked out because his whole life he's been obsessed with military history, World War I in particular, and felt the same as me when it came to past lives. He wasn't sure they were real, but felt if they were, he had died in World War I. I had a powerful dream once where I met a very stern angel. He was 7 feet tall and immensely strong. His eyes were like fire. He explained to me that's the Holy Spirit in him. I was baptized recently at age 30. I am now 32. I felt he was annoyed being in my presence, but God sent him to answer some of my questions and guide me. However annoyed he was, I remember he clearly stated a nice answer to this question. I asked him, "What religion is the best religion?" And he said, "The religion that brings you closest to God." Not me, but my brother. Hopefully he doesn't mind me telling this. My parents told me about it after the incident happened. They were pretty freaked out. When he was 4 years old or so, my parents were training him to use the toilet. After seeing the toilet paper, he said, "I used to use big leaves." And then he proceeds to tell a crazy story. He said the names of a whole bunch of brothers and sisters. His house was built in something like 1905 or 1907, if I remember right, and his last name was Hayer. When he was 9 years old, he was playing in the loft of a barn and fell and died. And he said, "Then I became an egg again." He completely forgot about everything when my parents tried asking him about it again. I wish there was some way to find out where in the world that could even be. My brother was born in Colorado, but he would have told the story when we lived in Texas. Ironically, my parents, while freaked out a bit by the story, ended up not believing it. My dad's a pretty hardcore Christian of the more skeptical variety, and neither of my parents believe in reincarnation. He just says, I don't know where he could have come up with those ideas at his age, but he must have made it up. It annoys me a bit that they didn't write anything down. It would have been interesting to find out if it's true. They should have asked, what was your street address? What year was it? Or something like that. Personally, I believe it. I know my parents wouldn't be one to make up something like that, and I doubt my brother was creative enough to make up something like that when he was 4. My parents telling me that story totally planted the first seeds for me not being Christian. What exists after death? Who knows? Where does consciousness come from? No idea. But I'm not worried about it. In fact, I'm going to be visiting New Orleans next month. If I die there, maybe I can at least get a good daiquiri first. I'm hoping to live long enough to at least hear the Blind Guardian symphonic album and play Half-Life 3, though.